This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio is brought to you by the IEEE Computer Society and by IEEE Software Magazine. Online at computer.org/software. Become an autonomous digital enterprise and your business can achieve A-game status. Intelligent predictive systems, effortless automation, and technology and people working in harmony. This is the Autonomous Digital Enterprise. Visit bmc.com/agame for more information.
Hello everyone, this is Felienne for Software Engineering Radio. Today with me on the show, Shawn Wildermuth. He has been tinkering with computers and software since he got a VIC-20 back in the early 80s. Shawn has been a Microsoft MVP since 2003 and is the author of over 20 Pluralsight courses and 8 books. He is an international conference speaker and he has recently released his first feature-length film, Hello World, the Film, a documentary about software developers today. Welcome to the show, Shawn. I'm really excited to meet you.
Thank you. How are you doing today?
I'm fine. I'm really excited to talk about your film because that is going to be the episode of today's show. As I said, you just released a film called Hello World, which shines a light on the history of programming and how it became a majority white male-dominated industry. What made you want to make this movie? Why is such a movie needed?
Well, it's interesting. I didn't mean to make this movie. I sort of accidentally made it. What I mean by that is I started to make a movie that I wanted to be sort of a love letter to the industry. And what ended up coming out of that was that I realized that most of the people I was interviewing were just looked like me. They were Western Europe as well as North American. They were white, straight, all the different identifiers you can think of. And I realized that I hadn't noticed that there was a lack of diversity. It wasn't just that I knew about it and wasn't doing anything about it, but that it didn't even occur to me to notice. I'd just gotten used to it being a boys' club.
That's so interesting that it took you that movie to realize that. Probably my perspective, being a woman in computing, has been a bit different. It stood out to me a bit earlier in my life.
I'm sure it did.
Then the question, of course, is why does that matter? Why is it important to shed a light on who's in computing?
Well, I think it's been interesting that we have a lack of diversity and we have a lack of understanding about different groups when we're building software. This ends up happening a lot. Facial recognition typically hasn't worked well with people of color because a lot of times there weren't people on those teams. The people who developed airbags had never tested them on women, so early on, a lot of women were getting hurt when they were getting in accidents, being hurt by the airbag itself. So we have a lot of ways that I think we can improve software development by embracing the ideas around inclusion and diversity. Certainly there's the right thing to do and social justice reasons for increasing diversity, but I think we can also focus on the fact that when we're writing software, if we're in a bubble of what we think is the right thing to do, we're not going to be writing software that's as good as if we had people from different backgrounds.
Yeah, we actually did an episode on that for people interested to know more about gender and programming design. In episode 380 on Gender Mag, we interviewed Professor Burnett, and she said something similar to you, that, for example, the idea that people don't read the manual, that's a very male idea, because female computer users are way more likely to actually read the manual because they are more worried about getting it wrong, so they want to read up more. So a user interface for women users might look really different for male users, and people, as you say, just haven't really thought about that because the teams are mainly male and they're like, oh, we don't need a manual because who's gonna read it? Well, it turns out women are way more likely to actually read it.
And in the US, it's not just the lack of women in software, it's also the lack of minorities. So American Black developers and Latinx developers in the US and Canada really are way less represented than even women are In the United States, Black developers make up about 4.5%, and Latinx developers make up about 5.5% of the total
Wow.
number of developers, and that doesn't make any sense when the percentages, at least in the United States, are much higher than that, just of the general population.
And do we understand why that is, both for women and also for Black and Latinx people? Why don't they pursue careers in software?
Well, there's different reasons for different groups. It's not one simple problem. Women were the first software developers, and so it used to be very dominated by women. In fact, the first eight software developers that actually worked on hardware, we're not, talking about Ada Lovelace time, but in the 40s in the United States, they were all women because software was thought of as sort of a something secretaries should do, that the men were going to go ahead and create the hardware, and the software wasn't that important. They sort of didn't think it was going to be as important as it was. And even in the 1960s, it was still considered a great career for women. Cosmopolitan magazine had a
Yeah.
great article about it. And so with women, it was a bit of a few things. We talked to the president of Harvey Mudd College in California, and she talked about that it used to be that if you wanted to be in computers, if you wanted to work with computers, you went to college to learn how to work with computers. And when personal computers started to come into the homes in the 70s and the 80s and in the 90s, they generally were taken over by the boys because a lot of these computers also had computer games, which girls were less interested in. So by the time they got to college, they fell behind, even if they were trying to pursue it. Like the boys had been programming and writing little things, so they understood sort of the basics of computers before they got there, and it meant retention at the college level was really difficult. In the case of minority access, it really comes down to levels of prosperity. So the fact is that when I was a teenager in the 80s, I was very lucky to have a computer. But people that were Black and Latinx, certainly when I was a kid, the chance of them having a computer, just because it was cost prohibitive, was really difficult. And then it became like they didn't see themselves in that role because we've never really modeled Black and Latinx people as developers. You don't see them very often on TV. It's usually someone that looks like me, the comic book guy on The Simpsons, for example. Like that's what we think of as what developers look like. And so it's harder for women, and I think especially minorities, to see themselves in the job, to see how they would fit in.
Yeah, so I think you're mentioning two important points there. One is for both groups, guess, early access if you're a child, having a computer and being allowed to play with it and to explore it. And the other one is role models, seeing people in the industry that look like you, that talk like you, that dress like you, to see, oh, this is something I could become in the future.
Yeah, it's interesting when one of the things I talk about in the movie is the effect of stereotypes. Like when we think of computer software in movies and TVs and those sorts of things, we get the same stereotype over and over again. And I don't know whether you've seen Jurassic Park, but in Jurassic Park, there's a programmer that is central to that story. And so when you ask somebody that's seen Jurassic Park, what do you remember the software guy, the tech guy in that movie? They go, "Oh yeah, yeah, he's the heavy set white guy, right?" And in that same scene, they pan over from Samuel L. Jackson, who is the head of IT in Jurassic Park. But no one remembers that because that doesn't fit their stereotype. It doesn't fit what they think a developer looks like.
And that then has a profound influence on people's choices. And I also want to zoom into not just people choosing themselves not to have a software career, but also the influence of society on that, on maybe parents saying to girls, or parents saying to their family members, oh, this career isn't for you, or professors at a university. Like, maybe this is a weird question, but whose fault is this? Is it the fault of people not choosing a career, or is it the fault of society pushing people out of the careers?
In the film, I don't have an answer. Like if I could solve this, I wanted to made a film, I would have went out and
Yeah.
solved it, right? It's one of those situations where There isn't a simple answer. Some of it is the age old women are told they aren't good at math and science, and so we've had trouble filling those STEM roles in general for years. Some of it is that women pursued it, and then when they realized it was so male dominated, and the unavoidable in some ways sexism that comes with that, the easier road often is to drop out when you're in college or to change your career once you started getting into it. I mean, unfortunately, that's a really common story. And the same thing happens with minorities, where, one of the people we interview in the film, when he worked with a team and he would run a team and he would go to clients' offices and talk to them, they would always defer to the white guy, assuming that they were in charge, right?
Yeah.
They expected that they weren't part of that team. And so I think part of it is this changing our expectations of what it is. One of the troubles I've always had with software, I've been in it for about 30 years, is when I talk to people and want to encourage people to get into this career, because for some people, it can be like a generationally changing career. Like it can really change the trajectory of families and all of this. And what I hear from them, women, people of color, whatever the case may be, is I couldn't do that because I was never good at math. And I don't think that math is that required for computer science. Like the computers do most of the math for us. And so I want to sort of lower the bar of what we think of as and promote as what computer science is, right? It's effectively problem solving that happens to be solved with typing, right? We're not building rockets, we're not designing 3D engines. Like 90% of all software that's written doesn't require, you to know how to do matrix math or calculus.
Yeah, that's a really great point. There was actually a recent Nature paper that said that your ability to learn a second natural language is more predictive for your ability to learn a programming language than math ability. And I think there's a lot to it, that it's not just that we equate programming and math skills. It's also what we believe about math skills is typically that you have to be born with it, right? You have to be
Mm-hmm.
born with the math gene. Whereas for natural languages, it's way more that if you put some effort in, you can learn a bit of German or Spanish. So I think that's also something we know for women, that if they know that with a little bit of effort they can get better, then they will put in the effort. But if it's like, oh, you have to be born for it, then women, as you already pointed out, just think, oh, I'm not born for it, so why spend the effort, because I'm not going to get good at it anyway because I don't have the math gene.
Yeah, it's very interesting to me, this whole notion of like the math and the math gene and all that, because I think we learn later in our life just how unimportant a lot of this ends up being. Like that we, as people, are good at a lot of different things and maybe not everything. And that software has expanded. When I started, like I would design all the UIs. I'm comfortable sitting at a keyboard and typing. And so that's what all the apps I wrote looked like. But the users, we used to sort of, shoehorn or force the users into acting like people that were comfortable with computers. It's only in the last maybe 15 years that we really went, oh, you know what? If they were easier to use, we wouldn't have to train them as much. They would like using the software. They wouldn't be afraid of it. Like all these things that in some ways these other groups are better than technophiles just in the in their parents' basement, as the stereotype goes, right? It's we can make better informed sort of decisions about software because we're seeing other perspectives, and we're admitting that we're not the best at everything, which I think is part of this. That keeping people out was like, well, software has to look like this because that's the only way that we ever use software.
Yeah, this is of course an argument that people make for more diverse teams, is that more diverse teams also have the ability to improve the product because you get these different perspectives. Do you think that's also an important reason? Like you said, there's social justice reasons why you want to bring people to programming. It's a great career, so that's a reason. But there might also be this reason that more diverse teams just seem to build better things.
Absolutely. And it's not just diversity in the sense of, oh, we need to bring this many women in and we need to bring this many people. It's more to intersectionality, as Scott Hanselman likes to talk about. And that is like, if you're building medical software, do you have people on your team that have medical problems? Are you building software for the military? Do you have anyone on your team that has been in the military before? Like, that understands and has the exposure. That isn't the same story, you know. One of the things that happens here in the States, not as much, I think, where you're at, but in the States, when you're developing something, often teams won't, especially web products, they won't necessarily test them against low bandwidth internet users, because of course every developer has what, 1 gigabit to their house and all that. Oh, this works fine on my machine in the office, and it's going to work fine when I'm home or on my 5G phone. But if you're going after users that don't have that, you know, that don't have the affluence that usually comes with being a software developer, we I want us to open up our minds about that a little bit and realize that we're not nearly all the same as we want to be.
Yeah, that's a great point. I want to talk a little bit more about the leaky pipeline. Like, why are we losing people? So, the one point is we don't get people into computer science programs, we don't get them into boot camps. But then another reason is they drop out, minorities. And you already mentioned that sometimes minorities drop out because they aren't seen as playing the part, they don't look like the manager, or they don't look like the team lead. But what do you think are some other reasons that people drop out of the field? And also, what can we do to stop that?
Well, you know, it was difficult for the film finding a lot of, especially women, to talk about it on camera,
Yeah.
because they didn't want to be, many of them didn't want to be labeled as difficult, or hurt their career by talking about the fact that there is real sexism in software. There's no way to get around it. And when you have people that in the software industry, even people of color or women, we kind of expect them to act like white guys. And what I mean by that is, it's very male to sort of talk about your ideas, proselytize or push them really hard, be the loud person that runs every meeting. Like, that alpha personality is somewhat expected. And those softer voices in the room, whether they're women or even white guys that don't have that, they tend to struggle more, because we have this expectation of how we act. And I think this is what lends that to it. It's part of it that, like, oh, I don't fit in here, or I'm not respected. But I don't want to ignore the fact that there's also having to deal with just the sexism of not being considered strong, but also, straight up overt sexism of, why are you here? This is a boys' club. Why don't you wear skirts more? Why don't you smile more? Like, all that stuff that we know happens in all industries. Like, I'm not saying that software is worse than X, Y, or Z. And I think some people have sort of come at me like, why are you saying bad things about the software industry? I think it's wrong everywhere, but this is my industry. And so that's why I care about it here. Right? This is where I live.
Yeah, I do think there are indeed two sides to it. You have this general sexism of women being not seen as serious, and also general racism of non-white people being seen as less of leaders and just not fitting the part, playing the role. But then also, software has this other image of being very geeky. I've been to offices of software companies where, there are Mario walls and Star Wars, and this
Hmm.
it all projects this idea of, look, this is what you should like. Where I think if you go to a law firm, I think you would be less likely to see Star Trek posters on the wall, or anything that really projects so clearly what you should like, what you should be interested in. So I think that specific part of, in programming, our hobbies and our personalities being so tied to your job, it's also adding to the issues that we have. Our industry seems to be built to a certain extent on this geek image, and I'm really wondering about your perspective of, like, can this be changed? Should this be changed? Should all programmers like geeky stuff? I don't know. What is your take on that?
I don't think it's a requirement. I think that is part of the we in the last 10 or 15 years, when I was more into hiring than I am these days, I noticed that there was a lot of push for, do they fit in, and that was sort of code for, do they look and act like we do? Are they going to be interested in the same things? When we go to lunch with them, are they going to talk about the next, Avengers movie? And that is, I think that it continues to be just a natural barrier to, being accepting of different sorts of people that are going to benefit your team, and being comfortable with people that, don't look like you, don't act like you, don't aren't attracted to the same sort of people you are. I mean, like, it really comes down to this sort of literalness. And if it were only overt, like there is overt racism and sexism, and we should get rid of it everywhere. But I think the real problem we have in software isn't that overt. It's the implicit bias, the bias that we don't think is really bias. When I go to a conference and I see a woman, do I think she's a recruiter or do I think she's a developer? Now, my first instinct is probably wrong, but I can make a decision to make it different. And that's one of the things that I'm hoping to sort of encourage, is to people to just reconsider what they're thinking, because I don't think everyone needs to be that way. I hid for many, many years the dark, deep, deep secret that I don't like comic book and I don't like Star Trek, right?
Wow.
Like, and it's like I'm at a central casting in Hollywood. I look like I should love those things. Anime, can't stand it. Like, I should like all that stuff because, I sort of fit the bill, but I don't. I really don't. I don't like Buffy. I could continue like a bunch of stuff that, like, I don't understand it, and that's fine. And I would sort of like go, I wanted to fit in, peer pressure and all that, and I would go, oh yeah, that. But when I was less confident, that's sort of the thing that I felt like I had to do to fit in, and that happens all over the place. When I moved to Boston, I realized that when I met people outside the IT department, that I didn't know how to talk to them, and so I started listening to sports radio, so that I could at least say, "Oh, did you hear about sports team last night winning?" Right? Even though I didn't really care, but it was something that I could just again fit in, and I don't think that's healthy in the long run. There are things that I love and I'm passionate about and I'm geeky about, and there are some things that I'm not, and I think that tends to push people out, because they're like, ugh, what if I like want to go home at the end of the day without thinking about software? What if I don't really feel like the only thing that I can talk to people like after work when we go to grab a drink is, what the new spa library is? Like, please don't ever talk to me about what the next tech thing is when we're trying to relax. Tell me about who you are and the things you like to do. And like, you're more interesting than that. I know that. You don't have to pretend to.
Yeah, I think that's actually also a big part of the stereotype of programming, is that it should be your only hobby, or one of the things that are acceptable, like movies and comic books and stuff like that. But
Mm-hmm.
all the other hobbies are not accepted. So I think many people are like you, probably sort of pretended to like some things that they didn't like. And I think the reverse is also true. If I look at my own career, like I really like knitting, which is a really female hobby. And when I was in grad school, I was like one of the few grad students in software engineering. Like I didn't do any knitting and I didn't talk about knitting at all. And I think a
Mm-hmm.
part of that was because clearly that wasn't the hobby that fits what my job was and that fit what everyone else was doing. So I sort of not did it. And then of course after a while it's not sustainable. Like you not liking Buffy is just not sustainable. After a while you're just like,
Yeah.
well, I'm grown up. I will just tell people what I like and what I don't like. But it's actually really hard, and I want to talk a little bit more about how we can change that. So maybe people are now listening to the show and they're like, "Uh-oh, our office has billiards tables and Star Trek posters and free beers and all the stuff that might attract white males and might be less interesting to other people." But how do you go about changing that? In feminist theory, you have this idea of a killjoy, which is a person that points out these issues and therefore isn't really liked, right? If you're a female developer or you're a black developer and you're like, why are you giving out free beers? I would be more interested in, free lunch or whatever,
Yeah.
something different. Or I don't want to have Star Trek posters. I want to have a knitting workshop as a team outing. how do you start that conversation? How do you do that while also retaining your position of being in the in crowd? That's a really difficult balance.
It's hugely difficult because the archetype of the killjoy is real, and a lot of people are like, oh, I don't want to be that person. I don't have one. I don't have an answer. I would love to have an answer, but I know for me that what I've encouraged people that I've mentored is to just be honest. I there's a story I tell. I worked at a company, and every day we would all go out downstairs and have lunch together. And it was a time we talked about mostly tech things, but it was a good way for us to sort of bond with a bunch of East Asian and American guy developers. Like it was sort of what you think of when you see the billiard balls and all that. And I had started a change in the way I ate, and so I started bringing my lunch instead of buying it downstairs, and I just felt weird about it, and like I'm gonna miss this thing and all of this. And you know what? No one even noticed that I wasn't eating food bought at whatever restaurant everybody bought. I was so concerned with what I thought they thought of me that when I started to just go, you know what? This is who I am. And in the first 5 or 10 years of most people's software career, they spend it in this being afraid of getting found out. That this need, this peer pressure to fit in is so important. And when I started talking about things that I actually cared about, that I thought were interesting, that weren't the things that everyone else was talking about, everyone started to bring up the things that they really liked. And it sort of opened that up. One of the other guys liked to fly airplanes, and another guy, wanted to do this or that. And I think that starts the opening of what is acceptable. And then we can go, you know what? Even though it looks like we're all the same, we're not. And if that's the case, why are we keeping people that we don't think fit into this image that none of us really fulfill? Why are we keeping them out in general? So it's not about tearing down the Mario posters. I think it's more about you know um, our personal ability to be honest with each other and not worry as much about being ridiculed or not fitting in. And this mirrors the same problem I see with like sexism in the workplace. We did a fairly small survey, but a survey nonetheless, where we wanted to ask people about a bunch of things that ended up sort of shaping the way the movie went. And one of them was, have you ever witnessed sexual harassment or sexism in the workplace? Like, not that you'd personally done it, but did you witness it? And the numbers were astonishingly high. And that told me something. That told me that there are people, and I've certainly been guilty of this in the past, and hopefully I won't be guilty of it in the future, that see it happening and are afraid to speak up. Because I don't know whether we can curse on here or not, but frankly, being able to go, Bob, you're full of leave her alone, or that what the hell are you bringing in here, that is the beginning of fighting sexism, not having a human resources meeting. That human resources meeting isn't going to change it. But when we hold each other accountable, I think that's where it starts.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely also true. I mean, for Bob clearly harassing someone, but also the smaller things. Whereas sometimes a female team member might propose an idea, and then she isn't listened to, and then a male team member sort of rephrases the same thing as sometimes women like to say in a lower voice, just the same
Hmm.
idea rephrased, and then all of a sudden people are listening. And there's also these tiny ideas where someone in the meeting could say, "Hey, I think that's what Stephanie just said," right? And then
Yeah.
bring the ball back to her. That also is sexism that bystanders can really counter or help relieve. That at least it's nice to know that someone also noticed this and that you can change culture like this. So it isn't just about overt harassment. It's also about these tiny like motions of, oh, eh, her idea isn't so serious, or she isn't so devoted to the company, or whatever things that aren't really true but are just someone's views.
And what happens is even if you just view it through the prism of white male developers, there's a percentage of those developers who aren't they aren't extroverts that want to be in the front of the meeting and putting ideas out, and we're losing their perspective because the only people we're listening to, male, female, black, white, East Asian, whatever, are the people that are willing to just be loud in the beginning of the meeting. And telling people to sit down and listen to everybody or to get that feedback is part of that. And that to me solves the problem that, or hopefully ameliorates the problem of let's get all those voices heard. We aren't just getting diversity so that we can say that in our head count we have diversity. We want to have diversity of ideas, not just people. And part of that is like, the quietest voice in the room is often the one that has the best idea. But if they never can speak up because, the alpha developer over there who wants everyone to know how wonderful he is never shuts up. You know what I mean? I mean, it's difficult, and unfortunately, I've been that guy before, and I was that guy when my self confidence was at its lowest. Like that's how I knew. There's this notion I have that arrogance in software development is almost always really about self confidence, lack of self confidence. Like if I puff my chest up a bit, no one will know how weak I am, and that hurts people who are trying to just be real when all you hear is just the puffed up chest over and over and over again. I would love to be able to take those people aside and say, we know you're good at what you do. You don't have to prove it to us anymore.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. And this actually segues nicely into the topic I want to talk about more in the rest of the episode, because so far we talked about the industry as a whole. And now we're moving a little bit towards a team culture within a company.
Mm-hmm.
So we're already talking about issues within a team. A person, and that might be a straight white male, is maybe more likely to play the role of the leader, the ideas guy who always dominates a meeting. Suppose you have a team in which non-white males also participate. What do we do? Like, how do you change that team dynamic? How do you change meetings? What do we concretely do to make this culture within companies, within teams, more inclusive?
I think it's difficult. I think we're so focused on the team lead idea instead of us being more of what I think teams usually really are, which is a group of people. So one of the things I found out while making the film that was it's sort of meta in this way is that when I started making the movie, I realized what I wasn't good at. Like there's a bunch of stuff about making a movie that I'm not good at. And so I had to go find people that I could team up with that were interested in what I was doing. And I realized that this is exactly what should be happening in software. Like finding the people that are good at what and passionate about the things that they're good at, putting together a team of all, super loud alpha developers, we already know doesn't work, right? You need to have people across the spectrum that care about different things. Even if you look at it in sort of the microcosm of a team, having someone that understands and is good with the back end versus the front end, or that understands the data stores versus the JavaScript or whatever the case may be, finding that team, but instead of just thinking about it as skills, but thinking about it as the interactions. When a meeting starts, there shouldn't be a leader to a meeting. You should be all coming together and trying to come up with ideas together without someone having to be, the leader. In I don't know how it works in football, admittedly, because I don't. Uh, I tried watching it when I lived in Amsterdam for a while, and I just don't understand it. But in most sports teams, there might be a leader, but their job isn't to tell everyone how to do everything, and that's what happens in software. Is like, oh, just move over. I know what I'm doing. Clearly, you don't. I there's this whole mentality of I'm the only one that can do it right, and I'm only doing letting you do part of it because I don't have the time to write it all. And I think we have to get away from that. We're all good and bad at different things in software, outside of software, whatever the case may be, and embracing that instead of trying to pretend that you're great at everything. It's just, I think it's causing our teams to be toxic.
Yeah, so that sounds like a great idea, having a flat team without a leader, having meetings without a leader. And maybe some of our listeners are like, yeah, I would like that. But how? Do you have any concrete tips on how to get to that culture? I really already liked your idea of sitting down and talking about personalities and interests to just get to know each other better. But then I guess you're not immediately at a situation where you are leader free and everyone's voice is equally heard. How to do that?
Well, again, I don't know that I have a concrete solution for it. I will tell you that what I did when I was leading teams was my role was mentor, not general. Like, that's the way I tried to view my job. I wanted to make everyone successful, and that often meant helping them when they wanted help and not helping them when I thought they needed help. Like, there's this idea of letting them fail on their own place. If I think leaders sometimes want to protect anyone from having any sense of failure, that they swoop in and don't let them fail and learn from those failures. Like, because failure to me is how you learn. I don't learn until I don't learn that the stove is hot until I put my hand on there a couple of times. And I'll never learn if someone doesn't let me do it. And so I'm not suggesting that it needs to be a completely flat structure, but that we think about the team lead in a different way in some organizations. Some organizations that they just want to take their most productive developers and make them the leader. That doesn't always work. You need someone that really wants to have the success and has the soft skills to allow them to do that aren't going to be, oh my God, this guy that works under me is really good, he's going to want my job. Great, because do you want this job forever? Like, it's never made a lot of sense to me. So I wish I had a magic bullet. I think at the end of the day that my goal is for people to be thinking about that they don't need to wear a mask at work. You spend so much time at work that I want to be true with these people and trust them as much as possible. The places where I was most successful in my job is when I was at companies that trusted me. So when I go to places and they're like, no, I don't have admin access to my own machine and I can't make that decision, and whatever the case may be, I'm like, they're just setting you up for failure. If I don't trust you to do the work that I want you to do, why are you still here? Like, if I have lost faith in you, you should go find another job, is kind of my mentality. But if that's not the case, then I need to trust you. And that comes within a team of just going, I'm just going to put it out there. This is, whether it's as simple as I don't like Buffy the Vampire, or it's as complex as, what, I don't agree with our position, but everyone else thinks this is the right way to go, and I'm on board, and I'm not going to come back and tell you, I told you it was going to be wrong if it fails. I was heard, and that's all I can expect. You know what I mean? And by having that, I think more people are going to be willing to be open and share. I just want, it may be Pollyanna to think that we can just not be playing games when we go to work and try to, create this career so that we go on this magic career path that we think we're going to be on, that is never correct. That, that invariably we diverge from. And by doing that, I think we get these added bonuses of, like, of course we want people that don't look like us and don't sound like us and don't think like us on the team, because that's how we can succeed more as a group and as a company and as an organization, or whatever the organizational unit is you're working in.
Become an autonomous digital enterprise and your business can achieve A-game status. Intelligent predictive systems. effortless automation, and technology and people working in harmony. This is the Autonomous Digital Enterprise. Visit bmc.com/agame for more information.
So what do you think is key to creating trust? What I think you just said was one thing that is really important is everyone should feel like they're heard, like their
Yeah.
voices are being heard or that they are being taken seriously. And that seems to me definitely to be an ingredient in creating trust in a team and trust in a company. But yeah, how do you, and you might not have all the answers, but what is your experience? Maybe you can give an example of a
Sure.
team in which there wasn't so much trust and you or someone else did something to create more trust.
You know, one of the things that I learned early on that I've tried to encourage people is that trust is a two-way street. And what I mean by that is, yes, you want to be heard, you want to have your opinions, but when I trust you with what I think is the wrong or right thing to do, it also means that if we don't agree on what we're going to do, that you're not just going to abandon ship. And so a lot of times what happens in these cases is, yeah, you were heard, and as a team or as a group, we've decided to go another way. I You sabotaging is not trusting. Like, accepting that the group dynamic is that we're going to try to come to the right thing, and that we'll pivot if we're wrong. Like, I've one of the ideas that I know doesn't work for everybody. I wish it did, but that I've sort of modeled my life around is, I'd rather make a wrong decision than not make a decision. So I'd love to make a right decision, but I'd rather make a decision and it be wrong than be stuck not making a decision. Having one more meeting, let's discuss it one more time, and everyone will finally agree on what we're doing. No, that's not how the world works. Sometimes you just have to barrel ahead, get your knee scuffed, and realize that you have to change course. And there's value in that knee getting scuffed. And I think the problem we have sometimes with trust is, the our leaders, the people running the teams, or more normally, the people above them, uh, want the trust from the developers of the teams, but don't want to give it. Like, oh, I'm going to give you a date on releasing this, or I'm going to give you what we're planning to do in this period of time. You have to trust I'm going to get there and not come in and micromanage and bring up a Gantt chart every 4 days to see, are we there? Are we there? Are we there? And that's tough because I think a lot of people are worried about the trajectory of their career or keeping their job or whatever the case may be, and that trust is hard earned. But it's one of those things. I think it's very similar to being in a relationship. If you don't trust, which has risk associated with it. If you are willing to trust, there's risk associated to it, but the reward is also much higher. You can stay in a super safe place, but if you're not going to take the risk of challenging yourself by trusting your company, or opening up about what you like and don't like, or that you really don't want the window cube in your company, or whatever the case may be, sometimes it's gonna feel bad, but ultimately, I think that risk is rewarded over the long term, on average, even though it's going to feel bad sometimes. If you're going to try to protect yourself from ever feeling bad, we're going to get to what we've got, which is a bunch of people just afraid to tell other people what they really think. And what that does in the case of software is it keeps people out that might be better at doing the things that we want to do, and that have different experiences that maybe we don't understand. And that's, I think in that way it's tragic. In the film, I ultimately come to the conclusion that this industry isn't as bad as I feared, but also isn't as inclusive as I want. It's somewhere in the middle. And that I think the only way to fix this isn't to have a conference where we all talk about it, or that we count the number of women and people of color who speak at events. I don't think that solves it. I think it becomes personally responsible for us to, when we have that thought in the back of our head of like, they must not know what they're doing because they're a woman, or boy, I wonder where they're from. They're probably not a very good developer. That you acknowledge it and go, I'm not going to act on it, and I'm going to ignore it, and I'm going to act. My actions matter way more than my thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to make where many people, maybe all people, have certain implicit biases. Like they indeed might think if they're at a conference, oh, that woman, oh, she's probably in sales. And
Yeah.
it's not terrible if you think that because you are the product of society. Everyone is. But you don't have to act on it. You can think, maybe that's a little bit biased. And also, maybe I don't have to express my expectation. Maybe I can just read her name tag and see what job she
Hmm.
actually has. So I think that's the concrete point that people can do, that you're not a terrible person for having these biases. You're not a terrible person for thinking that way, but think before you act. You don't have to act upon it.
Yeah. I mean, as a somewhat famous person just said, if you really think you're the least racist person in the room, you might not be. you know.
I want to zoom in a little bit more on more specific situations in which team dynamics and power dynamics play a role. For example, many people within companies, of course, do all sorts of feedback sessions, like for a promotion, maybe your peers will have to give you feedback, or if you're doing a code review in a team and you might be let's say, the sole female developer or the sole black developer, and you're giving feedback to an alpha male in the team. How do you go about giving that type of feedback? And you might say, oh, you have to create trust, but assume that some people in our audience are in such a team, they don't immediately have the possibility to create trust. What do you do in such a situation? And maybe also, what can other people in a team do to support them?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned code reviews, because code reviews are sort of the place where I usually see when I'm brought in to sort of review teams and such, that you can tell whether a team is toxic or not.
Yeah.
Because someone looking at my code is a really risky thing for me emotionally. Like all the imposter syndrome stuff I have, which I haven't really gotten rid of over the last 30 years, it still crops up. When someone looks at my code, my stomach tightens up and I'm worried. So I try to go into those situations going, I'm going to learn something here. And I might learn that my code's fine. I might learn that I don't agree with you about something, or I might learn that I can do something better. And when you're the one giving the feedback, trying to do it without the notion of shame or blame. Like that's where I see in sort of code reviews inside companies, it sometimes becomes like this deal of either no one is giving any of the real feedback because they're afraid of hurting someone else's feelings, or the reverse is where everyone's just going in so that they can notch their belt with another I told them, and neither of those are healthy. Like, you might think that the notched belt is the worst part of it. I actually think it's the other, where people are so afraid of what someone's going to say about their code that they don't want to take that risk. And when you're a woman or a person of color, when you're a minority in the room, it becomes even more so. You're afraid of of not fitting in or not, or, becoming the target of the developer who likes to count the number of spaces and find out whether you put tabs in your code. Like, we all know that person, and we need to sort of, as a team, acknowledge what's going on with them. You know, that confrontation, I think, is worth it, even though in the moment it feels awful on both sides. Like, having to have that talk feels as bad as having that talk being given to you. I was working with Chris Sells years ago, and it was a startup, and we were actually in an apartment. We weren't even in an office yet. We were just in an apartment, and there were two developers in each of the bedrooms. And I walked in one day, and Chris said, "We need to talk." And I was like, "Okay." And as we went to his office, the guy that I shared the my room with was already in there sitting, and I thought, "Oh, this is going to be bad. This is going to be really bad." But them telling me what they didn't like, which was I I tend to curse and grunt when I'm coding, which I didn't realize at the time, but it was really unnerving to my roommate. Was good because I was like, oh, okay. Now that I have the information, I can do something with it. But until someone, sort of confronts that moment, it comes back to that same thing of like, why don't you sit down for a minute and let's let Sheila talk? Like, you don't need to interrupt her anymore. There are these soft skills about learning how to listen, learning how to speak to other people, learning how not to be too aggressive or too passive that everyone needs to learn. And so, in those moments of whether you're getting a review or other things, just being honest with what you expect. Me and my wife have sort of a system that works for us. We're both a little touchy around our creative projects, and so when I ask her to like proofread something of mine, I tell her pretty clearly what I want out of it. Like, do I want you to tell me how wonderful I am, which sometimes I do? Do I want you to tell me if there's mistakes in it, or do I want you to really critique it? Like, and so by giving her what the expectation is, and vice versa, she does the same thing with me. We know what this is expected because as a developer, I want to find a problem and solve it, even if none exists. And this happens a lot in these interactions. Oh, you want me to review my coworker? Let me think of everything that could be a problem instead of going, you know, that those three problems that I might write down really don't matter. Like in the big scheme of things, they're awesome, and I'm worried about that they throw and miss pieces of paper into their trash. Like, does it really matter? Does it really affect me? And so, some of that is just, I don't have the black and white answer, but empathy is good in our industry if we can find it.
Yeah, and I actually think it's excellent advice to clearly say what you expect in a code review. In episode 400, we interviewed Dr. Michaela Greiler about specifically code reviews. And there she also said the same, actually. I didn't think of it when I was preparing the interview, but she also said, if you're going to do a code review, you have to say, what do I want? Do I want to know generally the idea of the code is like going in the right direction? Do I want to get feedback on how clean everything is, how well organized? Because at different stages in development, you might indeed be looking for different types of feedback. So I think that's concrete and good advice that doesn't only apply to getting feedback from your spouse, but could also apply in a code review.
And what's interesting there is I think it comes to developers or it's important for developers to think about the difference between is this good code or versus is this how I would have done it? And that took me a long time to learn.
Mm.
Like, just because I wanted to approach this way doesn't mean it's bad. And so I used to go into code reviews or look over team members' code and go, I wanted to approach it this way. And so maybe I'm going to get them to fix it. Well, it didn't need to be fixed. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It was fine. It wasn't the way I would have approached it, but that doesn't make it worse or better, and likely better, right? I only have one perspective, and me assuming that everyone that works with me should do it the same way is just as pejoratively bad.
Yeah, and these are also things, of course, again, forming trust and creating a team that you can discuss beforehand.
Yeah.
So suppose code is written in a certain style and you would like in a different style, you can have a meeting and discuss, hey, what style do we prefer as a team? Otherwise you get this back and forth like, oh, you should do it this way. No, it should be that way. Those are things also that can be decided independently of code.
Yeah, it's interesting when I had a client recently who he was like, should we go ahead and create like a code style document for what we want it to look like? And I went, that is the worst idea ever. Like, you're going to have a lot of meetings and it's not going to change anything. The best, when I was brought up, when I was growing up and I was learning to code, I was learning on Commodore 64s and VIC-20s and didn't know what I was doing. Like, I was just a kid. Wasn't like I went to college before I started doing that. And so I got a lot of really bad habits. And people telling me I had a bad habit never solved it. What solved it was I worked for somebody who had code that was so beautiful that I wanted to emulate it. And so that's another thing when I was running teams that I always hoped for, was that I was representing the example instead of trying to enforce the rules.
So then, suppose you want to agree on a certain style, what you would say is some team members would just create code that they think is good, and then new members fall into the code base and pick up the habits naturally.
Yeah, and I would think that I have told them before is, there's already code here. Just follow the same design. Like,
Yeah.
I don't want to have the conversation about 4 versus 2 spaces. I don't want to have the discussion about a space before the parentheses. Like, none of that is making our code better. It's just not. And so if you see code, especially if you're editing someone else's code, follow the style. And it's interesting that open source has really pushed that on me. Like, I get into a project, I'm like, oh my God. I'm like, no, don't fix any of that. None of that matters. You're here to help do a pull request. They've got the style of the way they have their code. Just follow it. You're not going to make yourself feel better by putting in a pull request that is all just chaining tabs and spaces and formatting. And, especially these days where the IDE can make it comfortable for you and then reformat it back to them. And, like, I just don't think it matters as long as it's sane. Like, one of the places where I always talk to people about is like, object and method and function names are important. Where the parentheses are doesn't. Like, sort of pick your battles.
And do you think this is true for team leadership as well, where it's less important to have clear documents of this is how we do projects, and it's more important to create a culture and to model the kind of behavior that you would also expect from your teammates?
I think that's the only way it's ever worked for me. Having the employee guidebook, as we used to have when I was earlier in my career, was just something to use as a weapon against employees. And again, that goes against this idea of trusting the people that work with you. And so I also mean that when it comes down to it, I can't take the shortcuts just because I'm the team lead or I'm the, whatever the case may be. As a consultant, especially can't do it as a consultant, because if they're going to use code that I'm giving them as an exemplar to something else they're doing, I can't just go, well, you're paying me by the hour, so I'm going to take these shortcuts. It's If you can't represent the example, why are you leading these people?
There's one more topic I want to talk about in this episode, and that's
Sure.
job interviews. So, in job interviews, there, of course, also inclusivity and diversity plays a role, because some people might show up to a job interview not looking like a developer. And also at the more content level, we have this culture of job interviews that we talked about in episode 412, where, these whiteboard algorithm interviews that certain people might have more exposure to if they go to a computer science program, for example, where they're really prepared for these type of interviews. People with a different background might not have access to the information needed for these job interviews. How do you deal with that? You want to get people in, but also, we talked about that before, you have this idea of culture fit. And sometimes I have heard from women that they're rejected from a job interview, and then the interviewer says, well, we don't think you'll be happy here. And then even the interviewee is like, yeah, and I think they were right. I wouldn't be happy there, but isn't that a problem if a qualified person that fits the job is rejected for probably not being happy? Then who has this issue? There might be lots of people in our audience that do job interviews. What can they do to get the right people in, and then maybe also to retain them later on? But specifically, how to get them in?
I think we have to think about developers in a different way than we do. The whole sort a linked list whiteboard thing I don't think is useful. But also how many hubcaps are there in London problem that is also a sort of interview question that happens. Because what it comes down to me, when I have hired people, is I am not looking for people with a specific skill or a specific mindset. I'm looking for somebody that can problem solve, because to me, there's really two main jobs that developers do. One is learn, and one is solve problems. Like those are the two things. So whether you like, I've been asked some insane questions of like, in the C sharp spec, what should you blah blah blah. I went,
Yeah.
I don't know. I would look it up. Like I don't know, and that's fine. Interestingly, I had taken an approach with software interviews because I knew the things I didn't want, and it wasn't again about skill. It was often about soft skills. So one of the things I would do in interviews was try to get the person I was interviewing to say, "I don't know,"
Hmm.
because it feels so epidemic that people are like, "I'm supposed to know everything," and part of what I need from you is to go, "I don't know, but let's find out." I don't know. Early in my career, I had an opportunity to go work with some pretty big names in software, and I just felt overwhelmed by it. And when we started working together, that was one of the things I would ask them about something that like was in a book they wrote, and they went, "I don't know, let's find out." And I was like, "Wait, wait, wait, you don't know?" And that's okay. Like it took that for me to sort of get that message out of like, oh, okay. The guy, I say guy, there I go using my my sexism, but the person that I want working in my company is not the person that's going to pretend that they know everything. That's toxic. That's scary because don't bluff me. Just be honest, and that way I can trust you. If you're like, "Oh, I don't know why that's happening." I'll find out for you, or let's dig in, or let's, dive into the code and debug and see what's going on instead of this pretending. And one of the things that baffles me in Europe is that the European CVs often will have the photograph of the person they're interviewing, and in the States it's actually illegal. It's part of our anti-discrimination laws, which I'm not sure are doing very good. But so the first time I saw a European CV with a picture on it, I was like, "What?" Because there is this in the U.S. There's this hiring bias that happens because they don't have a white enough name, or that their name is a woman's name, like where it doesn't even get to the interview, and uh, that's tragic to me. It's like, really, are you really going to go by this because they sound like they're from the Caribbean, or because it's a woman and you expect the only person that can do database design is a guy? Like, there's no great way to do that, because I don't always think that's a problem with them going, I think a man is better for this, but instead going, oh, this sounds like somebody that, would do this. Or what do you mean there's flowers on your resume? I want it to be taken seriously. Well, come on. It's their resume. They can look any way they want it. It's sort of my stance on it. I think the whole way we hire is broken.
And I really like that idea of yours where you say, I want people to say, I don't know in a job interview because that tells me a lot. How do you then, in that small space of an interview that's maybe an hour, how do you then there create the culture? Because people might be really reluctant to say I don't know because they're like, oh, I'm failing the interview because I don't know an answer. Do you explicitly tell people this is the question, and if you don't know, just tell me you don't know, that's okay? Or do you look for people who are already comfortable saying they don't know? I think it's great advice, but I wouldn't know how to act on it being an interviewer.
Yeah, it's difficult because some of it is about how you come across, and I think a lot of people that do interviews think of it as somewhat adversarial, and I think that's part of the problem. One of the things that I have talked to a lot of people about is when they're interviewing, sort of being on the other side, is don't go into an interview hoping you get the job. Hope you can get out of the interview finding out if you want the job.
Hmm.
And it's the same on the other side. Is let's figure out whether this is the right person, but we also want them to succeed. We want to hire somebody, and worst case, if they don't work out, there are remedies for that aren't terribly difficult to deal with. And so I think this idea that like the interview is this rite of passage, and this, having to scale the castle walls to get in, is part of the problem. Is it is we're hiring people that are good at interviewing, not hiring people that are good at software.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And as I said, episode 412 talks a little bit more about job interviews, also how to run them. But I think this angle of trust and making people feel included really, really adds something. Where I like your remark of saying, we also want them to be successful because we want to hire someone. It's not an exam where they fail. It's you want to find out if it's a fit.
Especially in where we're at, where we're literally having a hard time finding, software developers. In the U.S., I often talk about it as negative unemployment. Right, there are more jobs that haven't been filled than we have people to fill them, and so why are we being so worried and adversarial about hiring, about doing interviews if like we need the people? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and the same is true, of course, for the leaky pipeline and not getting enough people in, where everyone's like, "Oh, I'm looking for developers," but yeah, we we discourage women and people of color in many different ways, and also we are struggling to find people. That just doesn't seem so smart.
One of the people we talked to, the chancellor of UC Davis in California, he was talking about if we could encourage the black community in the United States to become software developers or be in IT in general. That in the United States before COVID, we had about 3.5 million unemployed, and we had about 3 million unfilled IT jobs.
Yeah.
Like, what we're missing something. Like, we're missing an important piece in the middle. We've got empty seats and people, but we don't have a good way to fill them, because I think it becomes this thing where we're so worried about finding the right person that we're missing the people that don't interview well, or who are soft spoken, or whatever the case may be, or that they're, in many cases, I know I said this before, but I really want to reiterate it, that we're not even letting them interview. Like, we
Yeah.
see, oh, it's a 22-year-old woman. How is she going to know how to do this tech thing? She's not even going to know how to wear khakis and grow, grow a neck beard. How's she going to fit in?
Yeah, and
Um,
also I think to a certain extent that we also miss out on people that have potential and that could learn a lot because teams might not be good at teaching so much. So they
yeah,
might not know how to deal with someone who clearly, for example, is very skilled in a different programming language, but not in this programming language. And they're really like, but how will we teach them JavaScript if they're coming from C or something? And that's not necessarily about the candidate because probably it's not that hard to pick up a new programming language, but it's also about the team not knowing how to effectively onboard people.
I also think culturally we need to uh, teach developers, especially in colleges, that, well, the language you're working on here rarely is going to be the last language you
Yeah.
develop in. In the United States, there's a NASA is trying to hire Fortran developers because they're all dead or retired. Like, they still have code that's running on that, and I don't think that's happening much anymore. I'm hoping that, in 20 years, someone won't come find me because they still are running Silverlight, right? That hopefully that isn't happening anymore.
I think that's a great way, actually, to close the interview. We've talked about how big the problem is, and you've given many solutions that people that are interested in could apply to make their teams more trustworthy and more inclusive, so that hopefully we can be a more inclusive industry. And of course, if people want to know more, they can watch your movie. Where can we find your movie?
Well, that's an interesting question. So you can view the trailer and visit the movie website at helloworldfilm.com. Hopefully pretty easy to spell there, helloworldfilm.com. And you're able to pre-order it today in North America. We're working on international distribution right now, and I'm hoping we'll have something to share first of the year. But we're planning on coming to a bunch of countries. Some of them have different requirements for us translating them. For example, the Netherlands requires us to have Dutch subtitles, and so we're working on some of those things.
Okay, so we just have to keep an eye on the website then.
Yeah, there's a newsletter you can sign up to. We don't
Oh,
we
cool.
don't send many emails, but we every time we have an announcement about a new place that is released, that's the best way. Or follow me on Twitter at Shawn Wildermuth, because I as most of my followers know, I'm not sick of talking about it yet.
Okay, we'll be sure to add links to the show notes, to the film, to the newsletter, and to your Twitter account. Anything else? Any other places we can find you on the web?
Pluralsight.com. I'm still writing and recording courses for them. I'm working on one on view forms right now that I'm really excited about. So that's always a good place to find me. I've given up all Facebook properties, so you can't find me on Instagram or anything.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Shawn, for being on the show today.
Thank you, and this has been awesome.
Become an autonomous digital enterprise and your business can achieve A-game status. Intelligent predictive systems, effortless automation, and technology and people working in harmony. This is the Autonomous Digital Enterprise. Visit bmc.com/agame for more information. Thanks for listening to SE Radio, an educational program brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine. For more about the podcast, including other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. To provide feedback, you can comment on each episode on the website or reach us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or through our Slack channel at seradio.slack.com. You can also email us at team@se-radio.net. This and all other episodes of SE Radio is licensed under Creative Commons License 2.5. Thanks for listening.